When people think of Dior, they think of luxury, expensive clothes, and maybe even nice smelling perfume. A revolutionary 10-year run by Christian Dior himself would set the foundation for a fashion house that is now worth $6 billion. One of the moments that set this new foundation happened in February 1947, when Christian Dior launched his first collection under his eponymous label. The New Look was actually a term coined by Carmel Snow, who was the editor-in-chief of Harper's Bazaar at the time. And Carmel Snow really does have a way with words, even in the history. She comes up with all these great little terms that get taken and shape time frames. So you can't talk about Christian Dior's New Look without talking about World War II. And by 1947, when Christian Dior launched his first collection, France was a country in ruins. It was still suffering from the effects of World War II, as well as many other European countries, including England. Fabrics were limited. Women could only wear a certain amount of fabric on their clothing. It was rationed. And of course, French people were still suffering from the trauma of the Nazi Germany occupation. Charlotte Sinclair actually wrote an amazing quote in her Christian Dior book. And what the quote says is, "Even 2 years after Germany's surrender, the roads that led out of Paris still bore the buckled and broken track marks of tank warfare." And that really just sets the tone of the feeling around the time. Haute couture was no longer a priority in a country that was so famous for it, because France was really trying to stand on its own 2 feet from an economic standpoint. There were couturiers like Schiaparelli, who had by then moved to New York, and there were other people like Balenciaga, who really just had a lot of fabric restrictions and was really just trying to make sure that his business survived. There's actually an amazing quote I found that sort of sets the tone for the time, and it says, "French housewives with precious loaves of bread." And I think that quote really exemplifies how scarce a lot of just resources were, that they're saying French housewives with precious loaves of bread. So times are really hard. However, French people are known for being very stylish, and rightfully so. And during this time, yes, things were tough, but the French women still wanted to look very stylish in any way they could be. At the time, they would wear boxy jackets and narrow skirts. But another thing that a lot of women used to wear was trousers. And the reason was because during the World War, a lot of women had to do the jobs of men, as men had gone to war. So you would see a lot of women working on the factory assembly lines. So it was really important that women were wearing things that were more comfortable and utilitarian, and less restrictive like the fashions of before. Hence, a lot of women would wear like wide trousers, flowy skirts, just so it's easier to move around. A lot of women would also ride bicycles back home, as there was a fuel scarcity, and also cars were just not really in demand because people didn't have money for it. Christian Dior, a fashion designer that was inspired by times like the Belle Epoque, missed the times of French prosperity and was quite pissed off that fashion in France had fallen to such a level. He described the fashion of the time as hideous fashion, and to quote him directly, he said, "Hats were far too large, skirts far too short, jackets far too long, shoes far too heavy." And he felt like the fabric restrictions and the fashion of the time did not really represent what French fashion was about. As a protest against limited fashion, Christian Dior's first collection brought opulence back to the streets of Paris, with looks consisting of long pleated skirts, corseted waist and hips, and boxy shapes. The busts were very rounded and the corsetry was very tight. It was a look described as very feminine, but also very restrictive. Style over function was back after years of pure utilitarian dress. And of course, because of how restrictive a lot of Christian Dior's clothing was, a lot of people were kind of on 2 sides. It's either they really loved it or they really hated it. One of the greatest fashion editors of all time, Diana Vreeland, who was a fashion editor when Carmel Snow was editor-in-chief of Harper's Bazaar, actually said that she hated Christian Dior's clothing in the fact that it was so restrictive and she would never wear it. However, she did see the impact that it had, and that's why she was a supporter of Christian Dior's work. Of course, these design signatures would go on to be termed the New Look after someone overheard Carmel Snow talking about how the collection was such a new look. So to give some perspective to how influential Harper's Bazaar was at the time, Diana Vreeland at the time was more in charge of reporting American fashion, whereas Carmel Snow would be the person to go to the shows in Paris and things like that. So when the New Look became a thing, it would be people like Diana Vreeland that would help disseminate the information to an American audience. And when you read Diana Vreeland's book, they give a huge sense that once the New Look came about, so many people in America were copying the New Look, and it became a thing even all the way in America. To give some context to how lavish Christian Dior's clothing was, in the Vogue on Christian Dior book, it was actually mentioned that there were dresses made up of 45 yards of silk. And this was at a time when people were used to rationing fabric. It gives the high sense of decadence that Christian Dior wanted his brand to be associated with. It was going against the limited fashions of the time. Another quote from the time reads as, "The complicated construction of even the simplest item of Dior's couture seemed to necessitate the employment of a maid." And now, if you need someone to really help you put Dior's clothing together on your body, then he's clearly targeting very rich consumers. Now, one of the key pieces in the collection that became iconic was the bar suit. Dior wanted to mold dresses to the curves of the female body to bring more attention to its shape. The bar suit is something that highlighted this very clearly. For Dior, the New Look brought back a clear sense of femininity versus what can be described as the stiff and austere aesthetic of the time. He revived Paris couture and created a new business model that was adopted all across the fashion industry. It would be Dior that would go on to build a good relationship with the media and use the media to his advantage. It would be Dior who would go on to having a lot of licensing deals, and these are the sort of deals that we still see today. So you must be wondering, what about all of this is slightly misleading? Yes, I know you're wondering. Now, I will actually tell you that the problem is the New Look wasn't actually a new look. If you look at the fashion of the 18th and 19th century, there are many items of clothing that have the same elements: the corsetry, the cinched waist, the pleated skirts. Now, one of my favorite fashion designers of all time, Cristobal Balenciaga, I do a lot of research into his work. And if you look at a lot of his work closely, especially in the late 30s to the early 40s, a lot of Balenciaga's work looks like what Dior did when he launched the New Look. So I started to look deep into it, and I actually found 3 whole pages in the Vogue on Balenciaga book that actually specifically detail what I was looking for. So I'm going to read them out if I can find my book. So this might be a bit long, but I think this information is so key when it comes to fashion history. So I'm going to read it out. I'll leave it on the screen too, so you can read along. So what it says is, "But the New Look, as it soon became known, was not in fact totally new. Even before the war's end, softness and amplitude had begun to replace the boxy, square-shouldered silhouette of the war years. In October 1945, Vogue summed up the Paris collections. The designers have manifestly been inspired by women's true form in a renewed avowal of femininity. No dramatic new line or silhouette, but a return, a subtle yielding to feminine lines, the lines of the 1910 or thereabouts. Tight little waists, rounded, almost Rubens' rounded hips, yards of evening tulle." Balenciaga was among those who spearheaded this feminine look with its wasp waist, exaggerated hips, softened shoulders and full skirts. In the autumn of 1945, he also dropped his hemlines to 15 inches from the ground ahead of Dior. But it was not the only look of the period, even from Balenciaga himself. Fashion wavered from one silhouette to another as designers experimented and explored, trying to find the way forward in the aftermath of the war. As Vogue had written in 1945, there was no dramatic new line. It was Dior's sense of drama and focus that would make all the difference. When he launched the New Look, he took a shape that was already circulating, focused on it, and gave it a brilliant éclat, I don't know how to pronounce that, sorry, by amplifying it with skirts that used yards of cloth. It was a decisive statement when the moment was ripe. In its extreme flouting of fabric restrictions, it also followed the fundamental rule of desire. The more unobtainable something is, the more we want it. Women wanted it despite the new set of restrictions it placed on them, for his exaggerated shape could be achieved with built-in corsets, underwired bras and hip pads. A British MP denounced the cage bird look, and some have speculated whether this fettering of women's bodies held back women's liberation by a decade, but women stepped into their new look cages with glee. Fashion magazines did not immediately recognise the decisive change the new look heralded. Many gave equal weight to Balenciaga's new shape of the season. He had moved on and showed a long jacket that eliminated the waist in a soft-cut backed cocoon over a narrow skirt. It was the polar opposite of the new look, where the latter was unashamedly nostalgic, referring back to the rosy era of the Belle Epoque. The barrel line, as it became known, was the first truly forward-looking shape of the 40s. This marked Balenciaga's break from the mainstream. Until then, his clothes might have stood out for their elegance, their graphic boldness, and their Spanish influence, but in their basic shape, they conformed to the fashions of the day. From 1947, he changed all that and began the experiments with proportion and volume that were to make him the master throughout the 50s and into the 60s. His great revival in this period was far more famous Dior. The two men dominated fashion until Dior's death, and so of course, we could say that Christian Dior's aesthetic of the new look could have been inspired by the 18th and 19th century, but also could have been partially inspired by Cristobal Balenciaga, who is a designer that Christian Dior very clearly respects. And that's probably why he called Balenciaga the master of us all. Another quote from Christian Dior, actually, he said, "Haute couture is like an orchestra whose conductor is Balenciaga. We other couturiers are the musicians and we follow the direction he gives." So that's a very clear omission of Christian Dior saying that all of us just basically follow the direction that Cristobal Balenciaga sets. And so the impact of the new look really came about because of the impact it had relative to the time it was created. It's not necessarily a new look in any regard at all. It's something that had been seen many, many different times, but considering the crazy use of loads of fabric during the time of fabric restrictions and what that creates, considering when people cannot have something, people want it more, is really what made the new look the new look. And this is why I always say, when we look at fashion history, we shouldn't respect these couturiers to the level that they are gods, because I'm very sure that there were other couturiers who were probably as good, but they're just not known because they didn't have a good relationship with the media, they weren't in the right place at the right time, they didn't launch things at the right place, right time, and therefore we've never heard of them. However, Dior was very fantastic at marketing. Dior had a good relationship with the fashion media when other couturiers were very secretive about their work and would limit media access. Someone like Balenciaga was an example of someone who would limit journalists coming to interview him and see his collections, and that's probably why Balenciaga could have gotten more coverage. But on that note, thank you very much for watching the video. Comment down below if you have any extra thoughts. And of course, if you want to support this channel financially, you can do so by subscribing to the Patreon, which is in the description below. But on that note, I'll be back with another video very soon.